Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the show. I've got a great guest with me here today, Hannah Cox, brand ambassador and content manager at Fee, my new colleague. Hannah, thanks so much for coming on.
Good to be back, Brad.
And if you guys are watching us on YouTube today, go ahead and hit the like button, make sure you're hitting subscribe, then click the bell notification because they don't actually tell most of my subscribers when I get a new video, the algorithms these days. But Hannah, I know we're not going to get into big tech. That could be a whole conversation in and of itself about the way our content's throttled sometimes and what to do about it. But I wanted to talk to you today about unions. So for you guys who listen to this show and don't know this, though you really should know this, Hannah hosts a podcast called Based. You can get it everywhere you get your podcast. She's on YouTube, Hannah Cox. Once a month, she does a deep dive on a different issue and breaks it down, the A, B's, and C's of it. And this month, she talked about unions, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Hannah, I found this really interesting. Honestly, this is a topic I don't know that much about, and I learned so much listening to your episode that I wanted to talk to you about it. But maybe to start, just tell us about the history of unions. I know they used to be a much bigger role in American life than they are today.
Yeah, I'm similar to you. I didn't really know much about unions before I did this show. Now I feel like I'm becoming a bit of an expert on unions, and I wish I didn't have to be because it's not for good reasons. But if you look at the history of unions in America, they've virtually always existed. You know, the basic concept of a union is it's pretty simple. It's just collective bargaining. And so if I come to you and I say, "Hey, Brad, we work at Fee and we want more money, and we need to create a package deal so that they give us more money," that's collective bargaining, and that's smart. That's something people can do in a free market. It's a really good way. There's more power in numbers when you're negotiating. And so there's some good examples of that happening even today. Like I use the cast of Friends as an example. We all know in the 90s, early 2000s, they were on a very popular show. They wanted more money. They band together. They got it. They got $1 million per episode, the highest any TV actors had ever made. That's great. That's what unions were, initially supposed to do. But we see really quickly in our history that they moved away from this kind of negotiating for employees with their employers and started using third parties to push coercion pretty quickly, using government regulation to actually start pushing people into unionization. So they removed the choice factor pretty early on. And you can kind of see this graph in American politics of them really starting to gear up in the Industrial Revolution, which is, late 1800s. Early 1900s. You hit about 1920s, 1930s around the Great Depression. You have FDR in the White House. He's a huge fan of unions, and he starts helping them get some really important legislation passed, including a bill in 1935 that really gives unions a lot of power. And so they're growing. They're having a lot of people join them, often, again, not by choice, but they're getting a lot of money from that. They are becoming very big funders for Democratic candidates. And so you see Democratic candidates continuing to push more and more laws that benefit them. And it keeps going and keeps getting worse all the way through the 1940s, 50s, 60s. It keeps expanding. You see the mafia starting to get involved. They're now using mafia as a coercive force on top of government, but they're very powerful. And a lot of people are involved. I think it's something like 1 in 3 Americans at one point are unionized. But then around the 1970s, you start to see that drop off, and they lose about 5 million members between 1975 and 1985. That downward trajectory has really increased and continues today, where we have the lowest number of people currently in a union in this country. It's something about, I think, 6.1%. So hardly any of our workers. And then you have about 7 million public employees who are in unions on top of that, but still, about 14 million in total out of 330 million people, not that many people in unions. And so I think that's why for you and I, unions have probably been sort of a back burner issue. It just hasn't really been something that has impacted me. In 1947, Congress passed something called the Taft-Hawley Act that basically said people can't be forced to join a union, or states can at least pass laws that say that people can't be forced to join a union. So you get the implementation of what we now call right to work laws. 27 states have passed those laws. And we see that once that started, when workers were no longer being forced to join, they mostly didn't.
Yeah, and I will say that and I want to talk about this in a second, but I don't want to open it quite yet. Public sector unions have come to the forefront lately.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about a few of those. But first, some of the things that you were describing when you're talking about how unions have behaved and what they've colluded with the mafia and the government, it makes them sound more like guilds that basically protect some workers at the expense of others. Now, a lot of listeners, when they think of unions, they think that unions advocate for workers, for the interests of laborers. Do you think that's on net true?
I don't think it's true. I think at times, you can look at some studies and show where perhaps they help some workers, they maybe help some people increase their wages, but as a whole, they actually hurt real wages because they do that by limiting jobs for other people. They do that by actually using, again, things that are not free market responses at all. They use the government to push tariffs and trade restrictions. They use the government to push regulations that make it more expensive to hire workers, and therefore you have fewer workers. They work to remove elements of choice from people and to make it where they can't get jobs unless they join unions. And so they're always trying to finagle these very basic decisions of who you want to work for, what you want to work for, how much you're going to make, how much you're going to ask for. They take all of that kind of negotiating power away from the worker and they consolidate it for themselves. And so that can end up benefiting a few, but it benefits those few at the sake of the majority. And then also what we really see them do is unions continue to enrich themselves. They continue to fund their bosses very, very well. They continue to give a lot of money to Democrats who then continue to kick them back special favors. And they have this really crony kind of relationship. But as a whole, this is not something that we've seen really help the individual. And it's certainly not something that we've seen help industry. Ultimately, they tend to hurt the profits of companies. They tend to make the people who are the least productive unfireable. And so that brings down the productivity level. And then they make it more expensive to hire workers. All of those are increased costs that companies face that, of course, get pushed on to you and I. And so they also ultimately make things more expensive for the consumer and hurt our economy in that way as well.
That's an interesting side I hadn't thought about. But yeah, anytime you're making production more expensive, a big chunk of that is going to end up coming out of the consumer's wallet. And that's something people don't think about. I remember I read about, and I wrote about this too, a study that looked into what the $15 minimum wage would do to childcare prices. And if you forced every daycare in the country to pay their employees $15 an hour, well, 30 or 40% increases, thousands of dollars a year, would hit people's childcare bills. And childcare is already so unaffordable. People don't think about that. But can you maybe walk us through what the difference between a private sector union and a public sector union is, and then what the most common examples of public sector unions are?
Sure. So the easiest way to explain it is if you're in a public sector union, you're in some kind of a role where you are working for the government. The most common types of unions that we see in public sector are like teachers unions, they're police unions. And these are the kind of unions that probably most people weren't overly aware of until the past year or so. They kind of operated quietly behind the scenes. If you spent your time at state capitals, you were pretty familiar with these unions because they spend a lot of time lobbying for different policies and laws. But otherwise, they just weren't as visible for the average person. But public sector unions are a problematic form of unionization because essentially it's the government collective bargaining against you. If you really think about it, it's the government coming in and saying, you need to pay more money for us to hire us and to pay our salaries. You need to push these special favors for us. And it's something that is so unfathomable that, even FDR, who I don't think I've ever agreed with on any other policy subject, was opposed to this. He was really in favor of private sector unionization, which would be any kind of business arrangement out in the world that's not government related, being able to have a union in those sectors. He was very in favor of that. But he was opposed to public sector union because he found that, if workers were to go on strike in public sector unions, who are they striking against? We're their employers. They're striking against us, the taxpayers. If they're lobbying for more money, well, they don't generate profits. They're just lobbying for more tax dollars. And if they're collective bargaining, then they're using their power and their status to have a greater influence on public policy than the American people do. That's a complete perversion of our system. And that's something that Democrats used to recognize. We didn't have public sector unions until the 1960s when JFK did an executive order and implemented that for us. So that's a more recent development, but it still continues to be the one that has the most number of members in our economy today, with around 7 million people who are involved, whereas you have, I think, 5 million people that are in the private sector. So it's a problem that we seem to be stuck with, but because of the past year's events, teachers unions lobbying to keep schools closed, often for very overtly political reasons, like wanting to defund the police or wanting to pass Medicare for all at the federal level, refusing to open until they got, their piggy bank of issues that they wanted. That created a lot of ire among family members and people who have children in schools who were locked out of their education for a year, often forced to, have one spouse quit a job to stay home with the kids and educate them. It really created a lot of havoc. And so something people are starting to pay more attention to. And then with police unions, given the events of the past year, with many of the police killings that we've had, the resulting riots and protests that have occurred, and the overall sentiment that we need real reform in our system. There's so many people that are trying to figure out why we don't have bigger criminal justice reform bills passing. But you and I know why, because we do spend our time at state capitals and legislatures. And we know that it's because police unions are often up there lobbying and spending a lot of your money, tax dollars, in doing so to block these kinds of reforms. So the taxpayers and the American people are like starting to connect the dots and recognize that public unions have been holding them hostage for some time, but they still exist. They're still legal, and again, they need to be addressed. The private sector is something that's kind of been taking care of itself because unions have operated in a pretty corrupt manner in the U.S. for so many decades, and because we've done significant things both through litigation and through legislation to protect individual choice in this country. Most people in the country no longer can be forced into a union. And when we see that they are not forced, they don't choose to do it. So this is the free market kind of addressing the problem in and of itself. But the reason we need to be cautious about this is because the current administration really wants to reverse these trends, and they are really pushing unionization quite heavily. In fact, they just announced a new union task force that is going to be looking for ways for the government to use its power and authority to push unions and push their special interests and try to help them reverse the tide on this.
So one of the things that comes to mind, though, there is, I agree, public sector unions sound pretty bad and pretty counterproductive and harmful, but what could we do about it exactly? Could we ban public sector unions? I mean, would that be a violation of freedom of association?
I don't think it would be a violation of freedom of association. We really would just have to overturn the executive order, to the best of my knowledge, because this was something that had never existed and then was crafted out of thin air by a Democrat president. I don't know that it's been entrenched any further than that. I would have to go and check and make sure there wasn't litigation creating precedent. So I'm not 100% sure on that answer. But I think ultimately freedom of association is for the American people. It's not for the government, right? Our freedoms are given to us as to protect us from the government, it's to constrain the government. It's not to give the government special powers and privileges over us. So, the government does not have a right to privacy. The government does not have a right to basically lobby against us with our own tax dollars. So I don't think it would violate the Constitution in that way.
Well, and then the other thing is, how do you get past the political inconsistencies on this? Because the right and conservatives and Republicans have traditionally realized unions are a serious problem, except for police unions. Those are fun and dandy and good. And then the left has its own blind spots because it can see that there's a real problem with police unions and other unions protecting bad cops, but then their beloved teachers unions can do no wrong. So how do you get through to people on either side of the ideological spectrum that they need to be consistent on this issue?
It's really very hard to do. And I think that the best way to do it is to not politicize it. I think we need to really look at the dollars and cents of it, look at how it's impacting us. And I actually do think if the average American really understood what was happening in their political process and how big of an influence taxpayer-funded lobbying like this kind of behavior is on our laws and what gets passed, and more importantly, what doesn't get passed, I do think you would see people starting to rise up against it. And I think that there would be a little bit more consistency. The problem is that these groups have mostly been able to operate in the dark for decades. They're not covered by the media. This isn't something that gets a lot of attention. This isn't something that the average taxpayer has time to sit around and research, or again, to spend their days around our institutions watching this go down. And so there's an awareness factor, I think, that's been lacking about the behavior from these people that hopefully we in the media can begin to shine a light on and draw attention to. I also do think that for many Americans, the union issue has, again, been on the back burner for decades, for 35 years at this point. It's not something they've really had to think about. But again, if the Biden administration gets its way, and I want to, go over, it's not just the task force that they're looking at implementing to try to find new ways to entrench unions. They're also really pushing something called the PRO Act, which is a piece of legislation that would essentially restrict or almost eliminate many kinds of independent contracting. That would impact 45 to 50 million Americans. They're looking to overturn right to work laws that would impact 27 states, not only as far as their right to work laws go, but also as far as their freedoms go from not having the federal government come in and tell them how to run their state policy. I think those kinds of actions, while I hope they don't pass, would create so much backlash from people that you could see unions really begin to be a more prominent issue for folks.
Can you explain what right to work laws are?
Yes. And I want to caveat this with saying that there's a free market argument against right to work laws as well. So I don't want to necessarily co-sign them, but right to work laws essentially were a backlash to the 1935 national labor laws that were passed under FDR. And once those bills were passed, a lot of people could be forced to join a union, and they were for many, many decades. And they were forced into very corruptive practices, and they often were bullied and harassed if they didn't join a union. And so in 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hawley Act to basically restrain unions a bit, to pull back some of that power they'd been given in 1935. And that's what allowed states to basically craft their own laws and say whether or not people could be forced to join a union. I think 12 states right out the gate did it, and then many have proceeded to follow to where now we have 27 states that have right to work laws. And what right to work laws essentially say is that no one can be co-opted to join a union. Now, you always have a choice to join a union. If you live in Alabama or South Carolina or any of these states that are right to work, you still always have that choice. You can still work to form a union, and you can join it. That's always up to you. We just see that most people choose not to, and they can't be forced to. The argument against right to work laws from the free market side is that they basically, it's a way that government interrupts contract with private businesses. And that's fair, right? You're coming in and telling businesses if they want to sign an agreement with a union, and then they're going to hire people, they can't say as a condition of being hired here, you have to join this union. That's something some businesses might want to do, and right to work laws prohibit that. So that's the free market pushback on it. What?
I said that's interesting. I guess I haven't really thought of that conflict, because I think of right to work laws as just protecting the workers' freedom of association to not be coerced into a union. But I get what you're saying about businesses if they want to only hire union members. But that's an interesting one. I don't know exactly where I come down on that.
See, I'm still in favor of right to work. I agree with that argument, right? I think that ultimately that's correct, and that the real answer is government shouldn't be involved in any of this. It should never have gotten involved in the first place. But I also think because things swung so far on the pendulum to force and coercion, that right to work laws were a necessary step to protect workers and individuals again. And then hopefully the next step from right to work is just getting government out of it altogether. But I'm an incrementalist. I think you're an incrementalist. I think that you have to look at policy as a progression. And as of where we sit right now, I think right to work is absolutely necessary.
Well, and what would happen if the PRO Act, which Biden and Democrats in Congress want to pass, specifically on the union front, it would eliminate right to work laws nationwide? What would happen if that became the law?
Well, I think what you would see happen quite swiftly is you would see huge unionization pushes at a lot of companies. We've already seen that they've been trying to gain ground in some of these more right to work entrenched states, like they recently did at the Amazon plant in Alabama. They really thought they had an inroad there. They spent a lot of money trying to convince people to unionize, and it still didn't work. So what would ultimately happen in those states? It's hard to say. But another component in the right to work legislation is that employers could be compelled to share private data on workers with unions, meaning if you were non-union, they could get your information. And we know what they've done with that kind of information in the past, and it includes vandalism, harassment, and bodily harm. So I think we can only imagine where that could go. But legally, what we would see is in those 27 states, you would no longer have any kind of legal pathway to ensure that you wouldn't be forced to join a union. Now, we have seen that take on many shapes. Like one could be that you couldn't get hired if you were to join if you weren't wanting to join a union. Others could be where maybe you didn't join the union, but you would still be forced to pay the dues in the union. So that's what the the Janus court case was over a couple of years ago. And so it's hard to say exactly what shape it would take on, but those are some of the different kind of directions I think we could see it go. But ultimately, we know they would start spending a lot of money to try to force unionization in these traditionally more red states. And I think that they'd focus really heavily on a couple of these key companies that have really taken off in recent decades, like Amazon and some of these larger distribution plants. That would probably be where they would really fight their battles.
So here's a question that I put to conservative guests a lot, and or libertarian guests even, and I know I've probably asked you something similar in the past, but if not unions, then what? Because I think oftentimes conservatives and libertarians, especially that talk about policy a lot, have a habit of just saying, no, I do this. But I do think as a whole, we neglect our vision, our positive vision of what we would do. And I'm including myself in this critique fully. But if unions aren't the answer, what is the free market solution in case to how we can improve the lot that American workers face?
Well, I want to be clear that unions can be a free market response. And I actually gave an example of this in my podcast. There are countries where they do operate in a free market way. Ironically enough, those countries are places like Switzerland and Finland and Denmark, where you see that unionization rates remain really high. I think over 70% of their workforce is still in a union. And that's because unions are doing their jobs in those countries. They're not coming in and using the government as force. They're not coming in and pushing anti-capitalist kind of policies. They're usually very pro-market, very pro-trade. But what they do come in and do is form groups, and then they go and lobby within the industries and the people who run the industries for better paying conditions for their workers, and they tend to get it. And so there's great examples currently out there of how it can work. I think that we should look to those models. But in order for it to happen in the US in that way, we would have to really restrain and repeal some of the laws that have entrenched their power and really change the nature of how they operate in this country. But I don't think unions on their face are a bad thing. I think it can be a very good thing. I think collective bargaining is just fine. But the problem is when you start using force. It's when you take away the element of choice, when you start coercing people and using third parties like the mafia or the government to come in and bully people on your behalf. That's the problem.
And if there's one thing that somebody listening, if you could just leave people with one thing they probably don't know about unions that you wish they did know, what would it be?
I really do think I wish people knew the activities that they take on, and they've done it across many states, and now they're trying to do it federally. I wish they knew how often they lobbied for people to lose their jobs. Like, it's not just that their actions have unintended consequences and end up being bad and taking away jobs. They actually spend their time and energy and money working to take away jobs. If they were to get the PRO Act passed, they would essentially push people out of work. 45 to 50 million Americans right now do independent contracting. Some of those people do it full time. Others like me, we do it on the side. It's a huge part of our economy. It's something that's really helping people have more freedom in their lives, more flexibility. And that's something that unions want to take away from them because they can't get a piece of that pie when people are independent. And they want to force them back into these really old, antiquated 9-to-5 jobs where people had to stay at the same job for 20 years and work 9 to 5 and didn't have a lot of flexibility or mobility or really any ability to increase where their standing was in the world. They were just sort of in this entrenched job. And so that's the model they want to go back to. And they're working really heavily to push us towards that. And I just wish people sort of knew their ultimate agenda and what it looked like, because I don't think it's a world we want to return to.
Yeah, it's certainly not my cup of tea. I know as a journalist, anytime I see journalist unions, like the New York Times union or the Vox union, they're the most woke, leftist, socialist, troll Twitter accounts who are basically tweeting out of the Communist Manifesto. And so I'm like, well, those people, I don't want anything like that representing me.
Right. And it's likely they wouldn't. I mean, that's the other reality, is that if unions have control, there's going to be certain people that they want and certain people that they don't. And I think that you could see a lot more discrimination that way. Unions have a horrible history of discrimination in our country. If you really look back, they almost always were there to protect white native born males at the expense of Black Americans, immigrants, and women. And so that's something that has been entrenched in the labor movement for a long time. They now have fixed their diversity ratios in that way, but I bet they haven't haven't fixed their diversity of thought ratios. And I'm sure it's still very one-sided. And the other thing is, unions have a long history of communist entanglements in this country, where starting with Sam Gompers, who's the guy who really got the union movement up and going in this country, he was an out and avowed Marxist. And this has always been something where you've seen a lot of communist theory and a lot of communist sympathizers that have been very entrenched in this movement. Now, Sam Gompers ultimately turned his back on his Marxism as he became more successful and realized it wasn't a workable system. But still, you see that ideology permeate. In the 1930s, the Communist Party turned a lot of its attention to unions instead of political activities because they saw it as a better vehicle. And they've always seen it as a way to create class warfare and to hopefully create an us versus them type mentality, because they want to see workers rise up and overthrow the country is their ultimate goal. So the fact that these unions lean so left, the fact that they give so much of their donations to Democrats, there's nothing surprising about that at all. These aren't capitalist institutions. These aren't people that are just simply working to negotiate on workers' behalf. They're pushing a political agenda, and it's not one that we want to see.
Yeah, well, I think that is a good place to leave the union topic. I feel like I learned a lot. Encourage everybody to check out your podcast on the subject. The links will be in the show notes. But Hannah, I know you're actually the first 3-time guest. I just realized having you on, I've been doing this podcast for a while now. It's been more than
you
6
have.
months.
Yeah.
Time goes fast, huh? And so that means you'll be the first person to offer up a third food take. I hope you still have something good.
I know. Does it need to be controversial, or can I just have like a nice, comfortable food take?
You can give us something comfortable because somebody will find it controversial.
They will. That's true. There's always something. Oh, you know what? I know something that is kind of controversial, but I don't think it is. I love boiled peanuts. Have you ever had a boiled peanut, Brad?
No.
I wouldn't think you had. When you come down to Atlanta for our next staff retreat, I will bring you boiled peanuts. They are a Southern delicacy, and they're really good. They're served hot, and because they're boiled, they're soft. And so people are very conflicted on their feelings towards boiled peanuts. You can have traditional, which is a very salty kind of mixture. You can have Cajun. There's all kinds of seasonings you can have. Commonly, you buy them on the side of the road from strangers. So it's like this unregulated, unlicensed kind of bonus to the whole thing. Or you can get them in gas stations. Like they're not a clean food, but they are delicious. I love them. If they weren't so high in calories, I'd eat them all the time. And yeah, everybody should give them a try if they're in the South.
You want to know something weird that I do? I have always, when I used to go to Five Guys, and I still do this, I would fill up my little tray with peanuts and I would eat them with the shell. The shell's delicious. It's so salty.
But you don't actually swallow the shell.
Yeah.
You do. I don't think that's good for you.
Oh, I'm sure it's not. But I started doing it when I was like 12 and I still do it.
And now you're addicted.
Yeah.
I had an ex-boyfriend one time who told me he didn't like boiled peanuts. And I said, what? And he goes, they were too crunchy. And I was like, crunchy? They're so soft. And then I was like, were you eating the shell? And he was. And I thought he just was an idiot after that. So maybe I judged him too harshly. Maybe a lot of people are eating the shells.
I don't know. All right. Well, Hannah, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Brad.